Today, we become legends.
Smite 2's first ever alpha weekend has now concluded, and I managed to squeeze in about 24 hours of games over the course of the 3 days. Here's my thoughts on what's good, what's bad, and what needs changing going forward for Smite 2. Alright, so let's start with the good. The game is super fun in general. I actually found myself waking up in the morning and itching to get on and play some Smite 2 as soon as possible, even if I wasn't going to make a video on it. Granted, part of this is definitely that the game is new and exciting, but the core foundation of the game strikes a really good balance between being familiar to Smite 1 while also making enough changes that it feels like a new experience. Considering that this is the first time we've been able to publicly test Smite 2, I was really impressed with what the team put together for the first test weekend. Are there bugs and jank? Absolutely, it's an alpha, but on the whole, the game ran well, felt good, and played good for the most part, and I see a metric ton of potential here. In terms of specific things I liked a lot, of course the new item system is as interesting, skill testing, and diverse as I knew it would be. I've seen a lot of people criticizing the item system, saying it's overly complicated for no reason, but personally I think after 5 to 10 games you'll get used to it real quick. There are some real concerns, especially with console in terms of active items and store UI, but I can't really speak to those personally as I've only played with mouse and keyboard on PC. But I definitely have heard a lot of people on Twitter, Reddit, and in my comment section saying the store is a pain to navigate on console and using active items is clunky for controller users. I do think this stuff can be ironed out quite quickly though, as Smite 1 has at least a decent item store system on console, and I fully believe people will get used to active items being a thing. I personally still forget to use them at times, and I can already feel myself getting more used to it, and I think by the end of the next test weekend I'll be fully on board with active items being a thing. The build diversity that comes with the new strength and intelligence system is honestly so interesting, and there's so much that could be done in Smite 2 that never would have been possible in Smite 1. Polynomicon and Hydra's Lament in one build, Kronos Pendant and Soul Weaver on Neath, Deathbringer Crit Ymir, the list goes on, and I'm still thinking about crazy stuff we could cook up once some of the Smite 1 gods that are yet to be added come to the game. It's going to be absolutely crazy, and I think the new item system is one of the biggest selling points of Smite 2 for me. The component system, I could take it or leave it, to be honest. It's just a side grade from Smite 1 system in my opinion, but the idea of every god being able to build every item and both power types is insanely interesting. I've seen a lot of people confused about how the component system works and saying it's too complex, and maybe it's just my ignorance as someone who plays Smite for a living, but I don't really see how that argument makes any sense. It's barely any different from Smite 1 system, honestly, and I think with some time people can easily get used to it. I got a handle on it from the first day of private testing, and I don't think it's too hard to grasp once you've played for a few matches. Moving on though, let's talk about the obvious, that being the graphical upgrade from Smite 1. At the moment, I am a tiny bit apprehensive about this, but overall positive. As it stands for this alpha weekend, the graphics are just decent, and I did expect a little bit more of an upgrade. The environment and FX look amazing, but I do feel like some god models, the UI in places, and a lot of the animations and stuff that pops up on screen, like numbers, health bars, and interact bars, could use some improvement. Animations especially are very janky at the moment, with many gods' basic attacks not syncing up properly, and some of the animations seem floppy. I don't really know how to describe it, but it seems like the swings for auto attacks and some abilities continue on too long after the hit, and it makes the gods look a bit like ragdolls sometimes. This is still in the positive section overall though, because it's definitely an improvement from Smite 1 for sure, and it is the first ever public testing weekend. There's plenty of room for them to touch up these areas that aren't quite up to standard by the time Smite 2 even launches into closed beta, never mind for full release. After the item system, my next favourite thing about the Smite 2 alpha was the god kit changes, and I have nothing negative to say about these other than maybe they could do even more like this, and I hope future gods that get ported from Smite 1 have similar attention paid to their kits. Some of my favourites are definitely Fenrir, Zeus, and Neath, but honestly all of the god kit tweaks going into Smite 2 have been really awesome to play with, and it breathes fresh life into some of Smite 1's older gods, which a lot of the current Smite 2 roster are, and it makes it feel much more like a true sequel rather than just an engine upgrade. I've been calling for these kind of changes for years in Smite 1, and some of the recent spicy changes have hit the mark big time there. These Smite 2 changes remind me a lot of those, and really help bring older gods into the modern era and bring some new spicy interactions to their kits. As long as they keep doing this stuff for future god ports from Smite 1, I have nothing negative to say about the god changes. Super exciting to use and really well done. So before we transition into the negative section, I do have one issue that I would say I'm sort of on the fence about, and that's the general conquest changes. Going from Smite 1 to Smite 2, the conquest map in general has stayed basically the same. It's still 3 lanes, Fire Giant, Gold Fury, 2 towers and a Phoenix, then Titan, all that good stuff. The changes made for Smite 2's conquest are a bit mixed in my opinion though. Tower bounties are really cool in my opinion and reward early game aggression, though I do think the amount of gold they award should be toned down a little for future tests. The Warhorn is fine, though I have to say I do miss the Totem of Ku, and I think it could be a good way to solve the mana issues in solo lane for Smite 2, since there is generally less mana regen on items, combined with the removal of mana regen from blue buff. I think maybe replacing the side jungle gold pile in solo with the Totem again could be cool. I'm not opposed to the Warhorn, I think it's an absolutely fine objective, but the fact that it took Totem's place makes me not love it as much as I could, since Totem was one of the best changes ever made to solo lane in Smite 1. The mid camps being a rotating buff camp is just something I don't really like though. I can't say exactly why, but it just doesn't feel right, and I think either reverting these camps to harpies that maybe give some kind of additional buff like movement speed for a time after taking them to either get you back to lane faster or allow for a rotation after you take them, or just replacing them with a completely new unique camp with a unique buff effect. I don't know, I feel like a rotating buff camp that's just the same 4 buffs we have on the map at random feels uninspired and placeholder to me, and I hope it gets changed. The Gold Fury has definitely had a good upgrade for Smite 2 though. I really like the idea of each Gold Fury giving a permanent impactful buff to the whole team, and what each one gives can be fine-tuned as we go forward in Smite 2's alpha and beta phase. As currently, I feel like the first and second Gold Fury kills aren't really that impactful as they could be. I also might be wrong on this, but I think each Gold Fury kill is tracked individually per team, meaning it's your team's first Gold Fury kill that gives the out of fountain movement speed, and the enemy team can still get that effect once they get their first Gold Fury kill of the game, even if you've taken 2 more since then. I would prefer it to be global, so if you secure the first Gold Fury, the next one is always the second effect, and there's no way for the enemy team to get that first effect anymore. It would encourage aggression and early game objective play, as both teams have to really fight to not let that early Gold Fury slip away and lose those impactful buffs for the entire rest of the match. Overall though, I really like the changes to Gold Fury, and it's mostly tweaks that I'm asking for here. Another change I really like for Conquest is the infamy system and leveling up your jungle camps. It incentivizes good play with making sure you're taking your camps on cooldown as much as possible, and also incentivizes invades, because not only are you denying the enemy team farm, you're also denying the enemy infamy on their camps. As far as I know, you also get the infamy for your own camps by invading, which is even more reward for that. I'm not entirely sure if this should be the case though. I'm all for invades, and I'm very excited in Smite 2 for them to be so good, given how little invades have been worth in Smite 1 for so many years. But I think denying the farm and infamy for the enemy is probably enough, and you might not need to also get infamy for your own buffs. We'd have to see though and get more testing, but at the moment I feel like invade strats might be a little too good in the alpha if anything. Don't completely nuke them to Smite 1 status, but perhaps tone them down a little bit. Jungling in general feels a lot more involved in Smite 2 as well, since laners don't take their own buffs quite as much, and the respawn timers on back camps are very low, so it feels like the jungler does have more actual jungling to do in Smite 2, which I'm definitely a fan of. Something I'm not a fan of in the new Conquest map though is the teleporters. I've said this for a while now that I don't like their addition in Smite 1, and I also don't like that they're committing to them in Smite 2 either. I think it encourages bad map play and positioning and doesn't bring anything new to the table except making the map feel smaller. Adding a camp in the side lane jungles where the teleporters currently are would make a lot more sense for Smite 2 in my opinion. As I mentioned, overall, I think the Conquest changes are pretty mixed. There are some things I really like the infamy system, tower bounties, and the new Gold Fury rewards. Some things I'm indifferent to, like the Stealth Grass and the Warhorn, and some things I really don't like teleporters and the rotating mid buff camp. The nice thing about this though is that it's an alpha, and it's the first public test of the alpha. Many of these things will not be final, and while I don't have much hope for teleporters being axed, since for whatever reason Hi-Rez really seems to like having them, I do think a lot of the smaller things I dislike about new Conquest can be changed in future tests, or in the beta, and overall, Conquest still feels like Conquest, and I respect them for trying new things like the Warhorn and Gold Fury rewards. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. Hopefully the ones that didn't work can be changed. I guess I'll also quickly mention this in the negative section, but it's an obvious one that isn't really a negative, that being the lack of content. It does feel very bare bones at the moment, with only a handful of gods, just one mode, and an item pool that is clearly lacking in some areas to where builds don't quite feel complete. The reason I say that it's not really a negative though is because it's the first ever public test of Smite 2 and it's an alpha. There will absolutely be more content added at a pretty rapid pace as we get towards closed and open beta and eventually full release, so take everything I say about the content of the game with a grain of salt. That said, I have noticed some major gaps in builds like int lifesteal items, items with specific kind of defense. There are very few dedicated magical or physical defense options. A lot of them are either health or hybrid defense. And of course, the lack of flat penetration in the game still confuses me as to why they removed it, given it's so integral to the early game of mid laners and junglers. Starter items are also sorely missed in Smite 2, and I think at the very least we should get back basic starter items that we sell late game, just to smooth out the power curve of the early game and make jungle and support feel better. At the moment, jungling early game feels like you need to buy several potions every time you back just to stay out for a reasonable amount of time, and supports have to be ridiculously aggressive invading enemy camps or taking your own jungler's farm just to keep up in gold. So having a green starter that allows supports to keep up in gold through assists and something for junglers to allow them to sustain would be amazing, along with options for the 3 other roles as well. Personally, I would love to see the full level 20 upgrade starter items back like we have in Smite 1, as I feel they're one of the best additions we ever got in that game, and the new item system could allow for so many cool and powerful level 20 starters that would be a blast to play with. But I can also see the argument that with the new item system allowing for crazy unique builds already, you might want to leave out upgradable starters at least for now so we can have full 6 item builds with the new stuff. Though at the very least, I think basic, seldom late game starters should be added soon. Another big issue I had with the alpha was everyone having beads on such a low cooldown, specifically for tanks. A lot of the way you deal with tanks in Smite 1 is by locking them down with a CC and focusing them, but in Smite 2 it feels insanely annoying to do so because they have beads from minute 0 on a fairly low cooldown. I'm not sure exactly how you solve this because raising the cooldown of beads to a point where it's okay for tanks will make squishies too vulnerable to CC, and you can't really assign a cooldown to it based on role taken because that's too abusable. It might require a small rework to the bead slot to maybe allow for a small handful of relics to choose from so that tanks actually have to sacrifice something if they want beads. This does kind of go back on the general idea that Smite 2's relics are on active items, but I feel like the current state of everyone having a fairly low cooldown beads makes the game really unfun for the early and mid portions, as there's very little kill potential, especially on tanks when everyone has constant beads for free. At least in Smite 1, going beads meant you sacrificed another relic option, and so if a tank does go beads, they're for going TP or blink or horrific or whatever, so I think maybe having 4 or 5 options for that slot could be good. Maybe you have beads, TP, Aegis, blink, and horrific or sprint, because at the moment it really feels like most of the time you go in for something that you just get beads every time. I'll also talk really quickly about balance, which, like my comments on lack of content, should be taken very lightly here, as it's an extremely early point in Smite 2's development, and I fully do not expect any of it to be balanced. That said, there were definitely major balance issues, with Fenrir and Zeus being far above the rest of the roster, blinking Amulet being insane for obvious reasons. Hunter builds seem a little too strong as well. There's also a major lack of options for tank items. The ones we have are actually quite strong, but given tanks have to be counter build reliant by nature, it felt like a lot of the time I was looking for something to build against a certain lane opponent or enemy that was dominating and couldn't find anything that actually fit well. So I had to compromise on an item that doesn't really work perfectly for that situation. That's getting a little more into lack of content than balance though. As I mentioned, take any balance concerns with a massive grain of salt, as not only did we only have 3 days to test stuff, so no one's truly figured out what's OP and what's trash, but also it's the first ever public build of the game. Balance will change on a dime and we can't expect it to be perfect with only a handful of limited private testing that they had beforehand. In general, I also got the sense that the game is far too slow. This could be because no one is very experienced and that leads to longer games in general because people don't group up properly to end the game, but the vast majority of my matches went 40 minutes plus and objectives seemed a little too hard to take. Especially given the amount of damage objectives put out and how much lifesteal is reduced on them. Lifesteal already felt weak given the lack of items that have it and the 1/3 multiplier on non-gods, but given objectives also apply healing reduction to you, lifesteal is next to useless against them. And they deal so much damage that tanking them is actually quite hard, which leads them to be taken way later in the game than they probably should be, given you have to get an insane amount of items to actually take them down. So yeah, speeding up the flow of the game a little bit would definitely be appreciated. But I think that's pretty much it for my overall thoughts on the Smite 2 alpha for this first test weekend. In conclusion, the game is absolutely amazing and I had a blast playing it. It feels like Smite at its core but has enough new stuff going on that it does really feel unique. Some major pain points for me are the teleporters, the item pool being a bit small at the moment and no starter items, as well as games going too long and feeling slow. Some highlights would definitely be the infamy system, the new item system in general, and the god kit tweaks and reworks from Smite 1 to Smite 2. What are your thoughts though? Did you enjoy the alpha overall if you played in it? What were your favourite and least favourite changes going from Smite 1 to Smite 2? Please do let me know down below, as I'm very interested in what the community thinks of the game now that you've all had a chance to test it out, plus the feedback will be useful to Hi-Rez in improving the game to be its best possible iteration. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.